You hear the breath before you see her. Shallow. Measured. As if each inhale must be earned. The room is dark, stone walls closing in like a tomb. A single iron sconce hisses against damp air, casting shadows that flicker and writhe like spirits. You are not supposed to be here. Yet here you are, barefoot on cold slabs, your heart racing like you've been caught in something ancient and obscene. The scent of dried rose oil clings to the air, thickened with sweat and iron. You step closer. A wooden frame creaks. Linen sheets are taut. On the bed lies a woman, not asleep, not awake. Her wrists bound with ceremonial ribbon, her hair combed and braided like a lamb to slaughter. Around her, they wait. A priest murmurs from the corner, fingers clutching a leather-bound text so worn the ink seems to weep. His lips do not move. But his eyes pierce through centuries. Two midwives stand at her feet, veiled, stoic. Their hands, red from a ritual you do not yet understand, twitch with muscle memory. A young boy with ink-stained fingers records what he sees on a scroll, never looking up. This is not medicine. This is not prayer. This is theater. A blood-soaked performance passed down in whispers. She is about to be examined. But not by choice. You don't know her name. You never will. Her story was written before her body was touched. She will leave no mark on history, only a stain on the cloth they will hold up by dawn. Outside, bells toll once. Then again. A signal. The ritual has begun. And you, watching from the edge of this room, trembling in silence, you are now part of it. They called it love. But history remembers it as humiliation, superstition, even horror. What follows are not myths. Not legends. But real acts. Sanctified. Celebrated. Carried out in the name of purity, honor, and God. None flagellations. Public consummation rites. Fertility trials under moonlight. They did not hide these rituals in shadows. They performed them in daylight. This is not the Middle Ages you learned about in school. The church bells have stopped. But the silence they leave behind is heavier than the sound. You step backward, out of that chamber, but the air does not shift. It follows you, thick, humid, humming with something unspeakable. Not shame. Not exactly. Something older. Something that existed long before shame had a name. Sex, in the Middle Ages, was not a private act. It was not tender. It was not joyful. And it was almost never quiet. It was spectacle. It was law. It was submission. To survive your body in this time was to survive the expectations carved into it, by priests, by lords, by fathers whose word was gospel and whose gaze was law. You were either holy or unclean. Desired or defiled. There was no in-between. A woman's purity was not hers to protect. It was a currency. A contract. A signal of her family's worth and her husband's property. But purity didn't end at the altar. It had to be proven. So they watched. They inspected. They measured you with blood and breath and silence. And when the blood did not come, when the ritual failed to perform as written, they declared sin. Not skepticism. Not science. Just sin. And sin had a shape. Sometimes it looked like a woman who cried too loudly. Or a man who preferred the stillness of a chapel to the cries of a wife. Sometimes it looked like a boy with soft hands. Or a widow who refused to remarry. The church had words for these people. Deviants. Fornicators. Sodomites. Witches. But the punishment was not always fire. Sometimes it was penance. A kneeling. A vow of silence. A ritual bath that did not cleanse, but marked you as unclean. And at the center of all this, fear. Fear disguised as devotion. Fear sharpened into tradition. They said the body was a temple. But they treated it like a battlefield. This is not about lust. This is not about love. This is about power, and the lengths people will go to preserve it under the mask of faith. You see now, don't you? These weren't whispers behind closed doors. These weren't sins hidden in shadows. These were public performances. Choreographed. Ritualized. Enforced. A woman accused of adultery was paraded through the town in rags, her head shaved, her body bruised by penance. A man suspected of impotency was forced to prove his virility under clerical observation, his body examined like livestock. And if a couple's union failed to produce a child, it wasn't seen as fate. It was seen as defiance. Of God. Of nature. Of the divine order itself. The bedroom was not sacred. It was a courtroom. The bed was not a sanctuary. It was an altar of judgment. And the witnesses? They were everyone. The neighbors. The parish. The midwife. The confessor. Sometimes the king himself. Some of these rituals were sanctioned by priests. Some, by kings. And some were performed with such frequency, they became indistinguishable from tradition. They were performed so often, so publicly, so casually, no one remembered when they started. No one questioned why they were needed. And no one dared to stop them. If you've already begun to feel the weight of this forgotten truth, this brutal mirror held to our past, then do not let this vanish like all the others. Subscribe to Tale of History. Because stories like these have been buried too long. And if we do not exhume them, someone else will rewrite them. Sanitized. Safe. Erased. And if you won't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. Not to debate. But to confess. You thought your body was yours. But the moment you reach womanhood, it no longer belonged to you. It belonged to your father's honor. Your family's reputation. And eventually, your husband's legacy. Virginity was not just a veil of innocence, it was a document. Unwritten, unspoken, but enforceable. A contract sealed in flesh and judged not by truth, but by blood. And if there was no blood, there was no truth. In the eyes of the medieval world, a woman's value, her holiness, her trustworthiness, even her place in heaven, rested on the fragile membrane of her hymen. And that membrane, they believed, had to tear. It had to bleed. If not, she was branded a liar. A seductress. A woman corrupted by secret lovers or, worse, by herself. So they watched for it. They demanded proof. Not whispered confessions, but physical evidence. Tangible, wet, red. The bloody sheet was the trophy of a successful wedding night. It was displayed for the household to see. Sometimes for the town. Hung from windows, carried through streets, stained linen fluttering like a banner of victory. There were even laws in some regions requiring the bride's family to produce it, held up by servants like relics, offered as confirmation that the union was valid, the woman untouched, the heir legitimate. And if the sheet came up clean, the ritual would not end. Midwives were summoned. Elderly matrons with cold hands and colder eyes. They would test the bride themselves, probing, inspecting, whispering diagnoses in Latin and Low German. Fingers pressed between trembling thighs, looking for tightness, for pain, for resistance. If there was none, the verdict was damning. Some women were paraded in shame. Others were sent back to their families, unwanted. Some were locked away. A few disappeared entirely. And what of the husbands? If he could not produce blood, he too could be tried. Not for impurity, but for failure. In royal courts, entire councils gathered behind walls on the wedding night. Advisors. Witnesses. Priests. The bedchamber was set like a stage, the groom urged toward performance as if duty alone could coax desire. A priest might bless the bed before entry. Nobles would toast outside, waiting for the signs of consummation, moans, shouts, the cry of pain that told them all had gone as planned. And when it was over, whether minutes or hours, they would demand the proof. The sheet, still damp. The bride, pale and silent. If she did not scream, they said, she welcomed it. If she did scream, they said, she was honest. They believed suffering was a form of truth. But what they never considered, was silence. The kind of silence that grows inside a girl as she's told, again and again, that her worth lies not in her thoughts, not in her hands, but in whether her body opens the right way, at the right time, under the right man. Some women faked it. They pricked their fingers. Smuggled vials of animal blood into their gowns. Anything to survive the first morning after. Others bled out of fear alone. This was not just a superstition. This was policy. Custom. A weapon cloaked in sanctity. A woman could be punished not for what she did, but for what her body did not do. It's easy, now, to see this as madness. To dismiss it as another relic of a darker age. But even today, girls are asked if they've saved themselves. Still inspected in whispers. Still blamed for the choices of others. The ritual survives, even if the sheets no longer hang in the street. So when you ask why these stories matter, why they still stain the edges of our culture, remember this. They taught women to fear the absence of blood. If the Middle Ages trusted blood more than a woman's word, and you've trusted me to tell you this story, the least you can do is subscribe. If not, tell us in the comments why that's fair. The body, in the Middle Ages, was not merely flesh. It was a vessel. A battlefield. A map of suffering that could be offered to God, like incense burned in slow surrender. And no one gave their bodies more completely than the saints. You picture sainthood as peace, halos, hymns, light pouring through stained glass. But the truth was darker. The saints of medieval Europe did not drift gently into holiness. They bled into it. Starved for it. Beat themselves, bruised themselves, offered their nakedness to the void in hopes that the void would whisper back. Some claimed it did. Saint Catherine of Siena was only 7 when she first saw him. Not a priest. Not a statue. But Christ himself, glowing, wounded, radiant. She said he called her his bride. That he placed a ring on her finger, not gold, but flesh. His own foreskin, she said, removed in infancy and preserved for her alone. You recoil. But to her, this was not grotesque. It was divine. She wrote letters in ecstasy, love letters not to a lover, but to the crucified body she adored. She called him, my sweet Jesus, and begged to suffer more so that she might join him in his agony. Her hunger for union was physical. She refused food for weeks, living only on the Eucharist, claiming that Christ entered her more fully that way than any earthly man could. This was not metaphor. This was mysticism, and it was filled with longing, arousal, pain. Other women followed. Some claimed that angels visited them at night, pressing them into their beds with invisible hands, filling them with warmth, fire, or even pleasure. They cried out. They wept. And then, the next morning, they fasted for it. Punished themselves for having felt anything at all. The church called it sacred. The poets called it divine madness. But the lines were never clear. If a woman spoke too boldly about her visions, she was called a heretic. If she kept quiet, she was a saint. If she suffered visibly, audibly, publicly, then she was worthy. Saint Lutgardes refused to learn Latin so she wouldn't understand the Massachusetts. She said she wanted to love God in ignorance, to love him in darkness, to feel rather than think. When he appeared to her, she said she tasted his wounds. That he opened his chest to her and she crawled inside. These weren't just dreams. These were institutionalized ecstasies, curated and canonized. The Church preserved their letters, their confessions, their moans transcribed in ink beside psalms. But were these visions liberation? Or another cage, just with softer walls? You begin to see the pattern. Even holiness required the body to be broken. Male saints were no different. Saint Peter Damian praised self-castration. Saint Simeon the Stylite lived on top of a pillar for 37 years, never touching the ground, letting his skin rot and blister in the sun so he could escape the filth of earthly temptation. Saint Dominic Loricatus flogged himself with chains while reciting the Psalms, one lash for every verse. He sometimes bled for hours, his back split open like meat at a butcher's block. This wasn't passion. This was policy. A holy man was a man who did not feel. A holy woman was a woman who only felt when God allowed it, and only through pain. What does it mean, you wonder, when divine love is always tied to violence? When pleasure is only accepted if it hurts? When bodies are only holy once they've been emptied? These were not private rituals, done in solitude. These were celebrated. They were copied. Young novices read the journals of saints and begged for the same torments, hoping it would bring them closer to heaven. Imagine growing up in a world where the closest thing to love is pain sanctified. Imagine never being touched except by your own hand, guided by guilt, laced with prayer, watched by God. I just told you about people who whipped themselves out of devotion. I'm not asking for a whip, just a click. Subscribe to Tale of History. Or explain your penance in the comments. You've walked the stone corridors of castles. You've seen the velvet-draped chambers of queens and saints. But now, step into the dirt. Step into the open air of a village so small it isn't drawn on any map. The wind smells of hay, sweat, and something heavier, something heady. Firelight flickers against tree trunks. Women circle a flame with skirts hiked high. Men drum with calloused hands, not in rhythm, but in hunger. It is the first night of spring. And the fields must be blessed. In this world, the land is alive. It hears, it watches, it responds. And if you want it to grow, if you want your crops to rise tall and full, if you want the wombs of your animals and your wives to swell, you must offer it something sacred. Not gold. Not blood. But sex. It is not a secret. It is a ritual. The elders call it a joining. The old women whisper its rules while crushing herbs between their palms. There are rules: the act must happen in the field, under the moon, before the planting season begins. It must be witnessed. And it must be honest, no false moans, no shame. Because the earth, they believe, can tell the difference. A couple lies down in the soil, bare skin against damp grass. Around them, chants rise. Sometimes a priest watches. Sometimes he participates. Sometimes he blesses them both and then turns his back. But it isn't always husbands and wives. In some villages, this night suspends all law. A married woman may lie with a stranger, chosen by the elders, blessed by the crone midwives who circle like sentries. She may not speak his name afterward. She may not look for him again. But if she bears a child, the village will say it was the gods who planted the seed, not the man. They call it sacred sin. They call it necessity. You call it what it is, survival, made ritual. The Church called it heresy. But the Church, for all its power, could not reach every forest. So these rites endured, hidden in the folds of festivals and harvest feasts. The spring bonfire became the maypole. The joining became a dance. But the meaning, the craving, the pulse, remained buried just beneath the surface. In England, bishops wrote bitter complaints of maypole mischief, condemning the wildness of villagers who danced until dawn, intoxicated by drink and touch. They spoke of masked lovers slipping into the trees. Of unwed girls returning home barefoot, tangled with green ribbons and secrets. In Germany, legal documents from the 14th century list fines for fornication in the barley fields. But the fines were rarely enforced. The magistrates knew better than to challenge the old ways. And then there were the night processions. Masked. Silent. Cloaked in wool and bark. Women leading men through woods lit by candlelight and bone. At the center of the circle, a man dressed as the horned god, crowned in antlers, draped in pelts, moaning with every step. He was not a man. He was fertility made flesh. To touch him was to be healed. To lie with him was to ensure your crops would rise, your womb would swell, your milk would not run dry. And women did lie with him. Sometimes in groups. Sometimes alone. The church sent spies. They returned shaken. Some left the clergy entirely. But none denied what they saw. The farther you step from the cities, the more the old gods whisper. They whisper through branches. Through roots. Through bloodlines that never forgot. They whisper that sex is not shameful. That bodies are instruments of creation, not corruption. And for a single night, the villagers listen. It is not hedonism. It is order. Ancient, primal, older than scripture. But eventually, the fire dies. The fields are sown. The women wash their thighs in the river and return home as wives and daughters again. No one speaks of what happened. But 9 months later, the village holds a feast. And no one asks the children who their fathers are. If this part of history makes you uneasy, good. It should. Because history is not always written in books. Sometimes it is buried in dirt and whispered in the dark. You've been shown a ritual older than cathedrals. A union both forbidden and sacred. Now I ask for something smaller. Subscribe to Tale of History. I'm not asking you to strip down and bless a harvest. Just press a button. Or if that's too much, go to the comments and tell us why ancient villagers could dance naked under the stars. But you can't bring yourself to support this story being told. The night was not yours. Not your silence. Not your breath. Not even your skin. You may have worn the finest silk, your hair threaded with pearls, your feet scrubbed and perfumed, but none of it was for you. You were not a bride. You were a vessel. A kingdom's bloodline in a trembling body. Tonight, they will watch. The marriage has been blessed. The feast consumed. The musicians have played until their fingers blistered. The priest has prayed. The witnesses, noblemen, envoys, in-laws, have raised their goblets and nodded. And now, the true ritual begins. You are led to a chamber. Not alone. Never alone. A priest enters first, sprinkling holy water over the bed. He blesses the sheets. He anoints the pillows. He crosses the mattress like it is an altar. Then the midwife arrives, placing cloth, white, bleached, starched, beneath the bride. Not to comfort her. To catch the evidence. Behind the heavy oak door, guests wait. Sometimes they are seated just outside. Sometimes they are behind a curtain. In certain courts, France, Castile, Bavaria, they stand in the room itself, eyes lowered, but ears sharp. It is not a night of intimacy. It is a performance. And you must give them what they came for. The groom removes his garments. You are expected to do the same. Slowly. Obediently. Not seductively, that would be obscene, but without protest. Modest, but not resistant. Submissive, but not cold. There is a line you must walk. And if you stumble, the fault is yours. The priest does not leave. The servants do not retreat. The night does not end until the act is complete. In some traditions, the bed was rocked by attending nobles to encourage rhythm. In others, the groom had to signal loudly when the act was finished. A shout. A gesture. A sheet thrust out the window with stains like metals. This wasn't confined to castles. Villagers, too, had their version. In rural parts of Wales and parts of early England, newlyweds were escorted to bed by torchlight. Neighbors followed. Family waited outside. The next morning, the woman's shift was inspected by her mother and the village crone. No one questioned the right to intrude. Because in their eyes, the body was not sacred. It was communal property. A body could not love until it had proven itself to others. Royalty had it worst. For kings and queens, the consummation was a matter of state. Dynasties rose and fell on a single drop of blood. If a royal heir was to be born, there must be no doubt. So the act was witnessed. Documented. Sometimes signed off by clergymen. A bishop once stood at the foot of a bed while a queen whimpered beneath velvet covers, her husband sweating above her, both watched like livestock in a stall. Later, the sheets were paraded through the palace, displayed in court, sometimes framed in chapels as proof of divine favor. If there was no blood, they blamed the bride. If the groom failed to perform, they demanded a second attempt. And a third. And a fourth. A man once forced to repeat the act for a jury of noblemen took his own life within the week. They called it tradition. They called it honor. They called it sacred. But it was humiliation, painted with incense and hymns. A holy violation, passed down like inheritance. No one asked if the bride wanted to be touched. No one asked if the groom was ready to be seen. Because the night wasn't about them. It was about everyone else. The body was a tool of the state. It existed to bear heirs. To prove loyalty. To be measured and opened and judged. Privacy was treason. Silence was suspicion. And love was irrelevant. And still, you hesitate to subscribe. They couldn't hide their first night from the crowd. So why are you hiding from this channel? Subscribe if you're brave. Or go confess in the comments. The confessional is dark, but it is not private. The wood is splintered. The air, stale. You kneel on cold stone, your breath loud in the silence, your shame already assumed. On the other side of the lattice, a figure waits, faceless, cloaked in robes, holding a pen to parchment and a list of questions passed down through centuries. He does not ask if you are sorry. He asks what you did. Where were your hands? Where were your eyes? Did you touch yourself? Did someone else? Did you spill seed? Did you finish? Did you enjoy it? The questions come like lashes. One after another. Cold. Methodical. Memorized. This is not mercy. This is extraction. Confession was not a place to cleanse your soul. It was a tool to catalog it, piece by filthy piece. Sins were measured, weighed, classified. A stolen kiss, 10 Hail Marys. A wet dream, 20. A single thought of lust during prayer. 30 days of silence and bread. But some sins were not forgivable in whispers. Some required blood. Adultery, in the eyes of the medieval church, was not a betrayal of love. It was treason against the divine order. The bed was not sacred, it was legal property. And when it was defiled, it had to be cleansed in front of everyone. So they stripped the guilty. Dragged them through the streets, their skin exposed to winter air, their backs marked with lashes until they bled in rivulets between their legs. Husbands who strayed were chained and marched in silence. Wives were shaved bald and paraded with signs around their necks, branding them harlots, serpents, Jezebels. Sometimes the lover was forced to crawl behind them, on all fours, like a beast. In one French village, a woman caught in a secret affair was bound in coarse linen and led barefoot through the market, whipped by a priest with a switch soaked in holy water. Her sentence, public shame, 3 months of silence, and a lifetime of celibacy. Her lover was not so lucky. He vanished. But what if there was no proof? Then came the forced marriages. Sexless. Lifeless. Administered by the church as punishment. 2 people caught in sin were sometimes ordered to wed and then forbidden from ever touching each other again. They lived under one roof as ghosts, no children, no kisses, no comfort. Just penance. The body, once so hungry, now starved by decree. And then there were the sin-eaters. You think it's a metaphor. It isn't. In remote villages, when someone died suddenly, especially someone with unconfessed sins, the family would lay a piece of bread on the corpse's chest. A stranger, paid in coin or ale, would come to the house, kneel beside the dead, take the bread, and eat it. They believed the sin passed through the flesh, into the food, and then into the body of the eater. He was reviled. Never spoken to. Never touched. But he kept the village clean. One man carried so much of others' guilt that his own wife refused to lie beside him. He died alone. Buried in a ditch. No prayers. No name on his grave. Yet they kept calling him. Because someone had to eat the darkness. And you, sitting there, absorbing this history, wondering how such horrors were justified? They weren't. They were sanctioned. Not by accident. Not by rogue priests. But by the system itself. A church that believed the body was born stained, that desire was a curse, that suffering was the only honest way to love God. And if you were not suffering, you were suspect. I just told you people ate sin with their mouths. If you can't lift a finger to subscribe, maybe you carry your own guilt. Write your excuse below. The mask slips on easily. The robe is stitched with bells. The crown, too large, sits crooked on your head. Around you, the crowd laughs, not cruelly, but with something else in their throats. Something uncertain. Something dangerous. It is the feast of fools. And for one day only, the rules are reversed. The priest becomes the fool. The beggar becomes the bishop. The choir boys raise their voices in mocking hymns while swinging incense filled with animal dung. Wine spills over altar cloths. Laughter rattles through cathedrals. And you, dressed as a bride though your beard shows through, take center stage, crowned as the Mother of God. They cheer. They bless it. They call it tradition. But beneath the mask, you are not mocking. You are revealing. The Middle Ages feared disorder. Feared it more than famine. More than war. The social order was sacred, written by God, carved into gender, sewn into garments, braided into hair. A man was a man. A woman was a woman. To confuse the two was to confuse heaven and hell. So why did they allow this? Why, once a year, did they dress up chaos and parade it through the streets? Because it was controlled rebellion. A sanctioned explosion. They believed that by releasing tension for one night, they could preserve the hierarchy for the rest of the year. But for some, that mask didn't come off. Not after midnight. Not ever. In trial records buried beneath dust, you find their names, scratched in trembling Latin, recorded by men who didn't know whether to punish or exorcise. Women who dressed as men. Not for festival. Not for farce. But to escape. To move through the world without the threat of hands at their throat. To read. To learn. To kiss who they wished. To enter brothels and walk out untouched. To earn coin. To command. One woman, caught in 1322, confessed that she had lived as a man for over a decade. She called herself Jacques. She worked as a scribe, drank in taverns, and loved a woman who never suspected the truth. When the church found her, they stripped her bare in the square. Not for punishment. For proof. Another woman, known only as Kay, posed as a male pilgrim to travel alone. She was arrested not for blasphemy, but for deception. Her crime? Wearing trousers. Her punishment? Exile. Yet it wasn't always punishment. Some towns watched women in disguise with fascination. They whispered. They stared. But they did not always intervene. Because somewhere, deep beneath layers of custom and fear, there was admiration. Envy, even. To wear another's skin. To taste another's life. Was it sin? Or was it freedom? Men, too, crossed the lines. In the Feast of Fools, some did it for laughter. But some didn't laugh. They wore the veil with grace. They mimicked not just the body, but the posture, the softness, the silence that was required of women every day. And in the play, something broke open. Something true. One boy, caught dancing in a nun's habit long after the festival ended, was flogged until he could no longer walk. His crime? Lingering. That word appears often in records. Not dressing. Not lying. But lingering. As if the real sin was not pretending. But liking it. They tried to contain it. Regulate it. Turn it into parody. But not all who wore the mask were playing. Some were slipping through the cracks. Finding the self they had no language for. Taking lovers in secret. Writing letters with stolen names. Living lives in corners and shadows, not out of shame, but necessity. These weren't performances. They were resistance. Wrapped in velvet. Cloaked in pretense. Guarded by silence. And now you know. That even in an age ruled by doctrine, the human spirit still bent the rules. Still danced across boundaries. Still kissed in alleys and prayed in disguise. You've seen how the mask became a mirror. So if this story made you see more clearly, even for a moment, subscribe to Tale of History. Don't pretend you didn't feel it. That itch. That awe. And if you're still too afraid to press the button, go to the comments. Tell us what you're hiding. You think fear is abstract, an ache in the mind, a shadow in the soul. But in the Middle Ages, fear had flesh. It had teeth. It had claws. It had genitals that vanished into thin air. Yes, vanished. There are records, actual testimonies, scrawled by monks in trembling script, of men who stormed into churches weeping, begging, clutching at empty space between their legs. They claimed witches had stolen their manhood. Not metaphorically. Physically. Snatched away. Made to disappear. One man swore he saw his member fluttering in a bird's nest outside his cottage. Another claimed it had been locked in a jar, guarded by demons, and only returned when the witch was burned alive. These weren't jokes. They were documented grievances, filed in ecclesiastical courts. And the church, for all its grandeur, didn't laugh. It responded with solemn rituals, exorcisms, blessings, holy relics. Some priests claimed the devil had learned to disguise lust as magic, to make the body betray itself. But it wasn't just men who suffered. Women, too, were believed to house a terror beneath their ribs, the wandering womb. According to scholars and physicians, some praised as divine thinkers, the uterus was a wild, untethered creature. If not anchored by pregnancy or intercourse, it could drift upward, smothering the lungs, pressing on the heart, strangling the mind. A woman who spoke too quickly, laughed too loudly, or refused to marry was often diagnosed with hysteria. The cure? Fumigation of the lower body with herbs. Manual massage of the womb by midwives. Sometimes, application of warm animal fat between the legs. She was not mad, they said. Just untethered. And it wasn't only women who were treated. Chastity belts, often more myth than widespread tool, still embodied a real fear, that desire could escape, take form, lead the body astray. So they wrapped iron around thighs. Laced locks across hips. Stuffed relics into bodices and codpieces. Bones of virgins, teeth of saints, slivers of wood said to be from the true cross. Boys were given rings etched with Latin invocations to prevent arousal in the night. Girls were forbidden to sleep on their stomachs, lest dreams invite demons. Desire was a beast, they said. And beasts must be chained. In monasteries, monks would bind their genitals in cloth or metal, tying themselves with cords until the blood flow stopped. They called it piety. They called it armor against temptation. One monk confessed to sprinkling crushed thistle on his groin every morning, hoping the sting would keep his thoughts holy. He died at 42 from infection. The monastery called it martyrdom. They truly believed that sex could unmake the body. That to feel pleasure too deeply was to invite the soul to unravel. Some feared that with every climax, a piece of you slipped into hell. That demons gathered in corners, mouths open, waiting for the moment you let go. You begin to understand. Sex wasn't feared because it was wicked. It was feared because it was powerful. Because it reminded people that their bodies were not fully theirs. That beneath every robe and prayer and Latin chant, something primal stirred, something that no church, no king, no doctrine could fully kill. So they tried. They locked it. Shamed it. Beat it. Buried it. But it still pulsed. It still dreams. And it still lingers in the folds of history, ignored, mocked, forgotten. Until now. They feared genitals could vanish. I fear good history might. Subscribe to Tale of History and help me resurrect what others erase. Or explain your silence in the comments. Death did not end desire. In the medieval imagination, it was only the beginning. You could live a life of restraint, fasting, kneeling, silencing every pleasure that curled its fingers around your spine, and still be punished if your thoughts wandered. If your eyes lingered. If your hands betrayed you in the dark. The grave was not a release. It was a doorway. And on the other side, they believed, the body remembered. Especially if that body had sinned. In the pages of purgatory visions, scribed by monks, whispered by mystics, you find a world built from flesh and fire. Where the lustful are not only burned, they are mocked. The man who chased too many skirts in life awakens in death to find his sex set aflame, not consumed, but eternally scorched. The flames flicker red, not with heat, but humiliation. He screams, but no sound comes. Only moans distorted by regret. The woman accused of seduction, whether real or imagined, wanders naked through purgatory, pregnant not with a child, but with shame. Her belly swells endlessly, but never births. Her back bends. Her steps falter. Every motion is a reminder of the pleasure she was told she should never have known. And then there are those cursed with endless want. They said that in purgatory, some souls are condemned to ache forever. Their bodies grind against air, fevered, unsatisfied, insatiable. But nothing touches them. No climax comes. Only the ghost of desire, circling like a vulture, hungry and mocking. And they were not alone. The church warned of demons. Specific ones. Sexual ones. Succubi, female demons who came in the night, riding men in their sleep, drawing seed to damn the soul. They were described as beautiful at first, lips soft, hair long, touch electric. But if you opened your eyes, they changed. Rotting skin, clawed fingers, eyes filled with smoke. You were not meant to survive the encounter. But if you did, your body would bear the mark. Incubi, their male counterparts, were worse. They visited women in silence, creeping beneath covers, mimicking familiar touches, lovers, husbands, even saints. They planted seeds in dreams, fed on breath, left their victims cold and empty. Theologians debated their origins. Were they fallen angels? Or souls of unrepentant sinners turned monstrous? Some said they were the offspring of Eve and the serpent, cursed to wander between worlds. But the fear remained the same: lust was not only a danger in life, it was a predator in death. Even the act of confession had to account for this. Manuals used by priests instructed them to ask questions not just of what was done, but how. How many times? Where? With whom? Did you finish? Did you think of someone else while doing it? And if the penitent faltered, the punishment was doubled. Because in the eyes of the Church, the sin was not only in the doing, but in the desire. A man who imagined a kiss could be as guilty as one who took it. A woman who dreamed of touch could burn the same as one who moaned aloud. Desire itself was the infection. And the afterlife was not a cleansing fire. It was a slow dissection. Not to redeem, but to remind. The body was temporary. But the lust it carried? That could last forever. So they taught you to fear your thoughts. To police your dreams. To confess not only the act but the fantasy. To prepare for a judgment that would measure your soul against the weight of your arousal. Even now, the echoes of that belief haunt us. In shame. In silence. In the fear that pleasure must come with punishment. But history, real history, doesn't punish. It reveals. And if this revelation has touched something in you, if you've made it this far through the smoke and shadows and still refuse to look away, subscribe to Tale of History. Because lust may fade. But forgetting? That's the real sin. And now the smoke clears. The chambers are empty. The chants fade. The torches go out one by one. What remains is silence. But it is not peace. It is the silence of forgetting. The kind that creeps in slowly, like rot beneath gilded paint. The kind that rewrites pain as tradition, violence as virtue, shame as ceremony. You've seen what they did in the name of purity. You've seen what they feared. You've seen what they punished. Bodies, breath, desire. But what you haven't seen, what history often refuses to show, is what was lost. Not just innocence. But passion. Curiosity. Defiance. The woman who wanted to learn and had to dress as a man to enter a library. The boy who dreamed of softness and paid for it with blood. The lovers who touched each other only in the dark, in silence, in fragments, because the world refused to see them whole. They do not appear in textbooks. They are not painted on cathedral ceilings. Their names are not carved into marble. They exist in footnotes. In margins. In accusations. They exist in the moments we are taught to skip over. Because they don't fit the clean story. Because their truth unsettles. But they were real. Their breath was real. Their shame. Their resistance. Their trembling joy when no one was looking. They were not saints. They were not monsters. They were human. And humanity is not tidy. It is not always holy. It is not always obedient. But it is always worth remembering. You came here for something strange. For something shocking. You expected grotesque rituals, and you found them. But beneath the blood and linen, beneath the prayers and punishments, beneath the ashes and relics, you found people. Not ideas. Not warnings. People. And now you cannot unknow them. They didn't write these rituals down to amuse you. They wrote them down to control you. And that control, centuries later, still lingers in how we talk, how we touch, how we judge. So if you feel a chill right now, it's not from the past. It's from the part of you that recognizes what hasn't changed. Don't let these stories disappear again. Subscribe to Tale of History. Because forgetting is easy. And silence is always the first ritual. If this episode disturbed you, good. You should be disturbed. Not because these stories are grotesque or obscene, though many of them are. Not because they defy what you were taught in school, though they certainly do. But because they were real. Because beneath every veil and chain and ritual wound, there were eyes. Eyes that blinked in shame. Eyes that rolled back in agony. Eyes that watched the ceiling in silence while someone else decided what their body meant. Because behind every holy decree, every priestly penance, every rule about who may touch whom and how many times, there was a system. A system designed not to uplift the soul, but to break the body. You've seen it now. How they wrapped power in cloth and called it purity. How they took pleasure and turned it into punishment. How they twisted fear into obedience and called it faith. They told you this was morality. But it was control. They told you this was civilization. But it was survival, in slow motion. And now you know. So the question is not whether you were entertained. The question is, what will you do with what you've learned? Because to walk away unchanged is to let the silence win. To forget the woman whose blood was demanded to prove her worth. To forget the monk who flogged himself because his thoughts strayed. To forget the boy who danced in secret until someone saw him, and he never danced again. If you've made it this far, 40 minutes deep into what the world tried to erase, you are not just a viewer anymore. You are a witness. And witnesses have choices. You can turn your back. Pretend you were never here. Let the screen go black and the past slide back into the grave. Or you can choose to remember. You can choose to say, this happened. This mattered. This deserves light. Subscribe to Tale of History. Not for me. For them. Because our history is not clean. It is soaked, in sweat, in blood, in silence. And if you've made it this far without subscribing, ask yourself, are you watching, or just consuming? Are you a witness, or a coward? Subscribe now. Or confess in the comments. I'll be watching.